Never mind the Balearics. We had two spells in Ibiza during 1985 that were interrupted by the remaining shows of the World Tour, and a spell in Ireland, but for convenience I'll squash both Spanish episodes into this chapter. The band, Wally and French John, were all on the plane. Wally came along because there was bound to be some socialising while we were there, and it was probably a good idea that he was there to extract us from any potential scrapes. The recording was done largely in the afternoons, with the morning spent in bed sleeping off the night before and the evening spent preparing for the hangover for the following morning. The studio belonged to Judas Priest, and their drummer Dave Holland was in residence, as well as a Spanish guy who'd prepare meals for us. The studio engineer was a lovely guy called Dennis Herman, a mellow American who'd lived on the island for some time. The studio was up in the hills near Santa Eulalia from what I remember, but this is hard to confirm as it's since been destroyed during a fire. The remote location would mean we'd need some transport, and the only drivers amongst us were French John, Ped and Wally. Mark was taking lessons, but he hadn't had enough to take his test. The studio put us in touch with a Scottish guy who hired cars and bikes on the island, and wanting to impress the visiting pop stars, he ended up renting us his own car, a pretty nice Peugeot if I remember. That was a mistake. Within the first 3 days of having the car, Mark fancied conducting his own driving lesson and drove it around the courtyard in front of the studio complex. All we heard from inside was the clang of metal hitting tree. A heavy foot on the accelerator coupled with a slow foot on the brake meant that the car had to be towed back to Ibiza town for repair, but not before Mark had his photograph taken sitting proudly on the crumpled bonnet. To be fair to the owner, he took it well and gave us another one. We also hired some bikes. Ped and Mark had both rode motorbikes before, but I'd never driven anything. This meant they hired a couple of scramblers and I had a Honda Scoopy, a little bright red moped. I looked a bit of a twat to say the least, but the electronic ignition meant it started first time every time, and I could get a head start on the other two whilst they kick-started their macho pieces of shit for 5 minutes before they spluttered into life. One of us was bound to come a cropper whilst tearing round the island on these death traps, and it was I. On the way back from a trip to the beach, I took a bend and looked behind me to see where the proper bikers were. I hit a bump, lost control and flew off the road into a ditch, missing a tree by about a foot. Luckily the Scoopy's top speed was about 40 mile an hour, but still, if I'd have hit the tree, I could have smashed myself up pretty bad as I had no helmet and was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I escaped with scraped shins, elbows, back and head. Luckily a thorny bush cushioned my landing. My biking days ended right there, and I've only ever been a passenger on one bike since. Most nights were spent in the bars in nearby San Antonio. I don't know what the place is like now, but even then it was a bit like Blackpool, with piss Brits in football shirts staggering all over the place. I wasn't very comfortable in some of these bars and was glad to have Wally along. The word would go round the minute we walked in, and one of our songs would always end up on the turntable as a way of introduction. This would mean attention from both sexes, and this, in general, was cool, but sometimes the vibe was a bit nasty. If I was a guy who'd spent the last 2 hours buying drinks and trying to get into some girl's pants, and she fucks off to go and speak to some fucking pop star, then I guess I'd be pissed off too. Sling some all-day drinking, a bunch of mates and a dose of green eye into that mix, and you could see how things had the potential to turn ugly. It never did, but I never liked the vibe of constantly having to look over your shoulder and preferred to go to places that were a bit more chilled. Looking back, I think this was a hangover from being kicked in the head outside Eric's a few years before. It made me wary and a little on edge, and there were times when the guys went out and I would stay in the studio and have a jar with Dave, or go into a beat the town with Dennis for a beer there instead. Wally was always on hand to discourage any nonsense, standing at the bar drinking pints of milk and coke. Not separate, half and half. Together, in the same glass. I know, that's fucked up, isn't it? Whilst we were in Paris, he told us a story about a bet he'd made during his time working with AC/DC. Basically, he ended up shaving his head for a cent bet. We harassed and cajoled him until he did the same for us, but it cost us a lot more. 100 francs, I think. We were in this posh hotel in Paris that had a hairdresser downstairs, and he went and had it done. We sent him back because he wasn't bald, and the poor French girl refused to cut it any shorter, so he finished it off himself. He had a load of scars on his head and it looked like a road map. By the time we reached the beta, it had barely grown back, so the sight of a 22-stone skinhead was enough to discourage anyone who fancied a bit of trouble. Although Ibiza was popular at this time, it would be a few years before it became the dance mecca of the Mediterranean and the likes of Pete Tong started showing up there. The Coup Club was open, as was Amnesia and Es Paradis, and we'd never experienced clubs like this before, with no ceilings and foam machines. We spent many a night getting mashed in these places. I remember Mark ruining a really nice Spanish hat that he bought only a few days before. Too much to drink, head goes down, hat falls off and lands between feet, puke comes up, head goes down, puke goes in hat. Game over. We bumped into a few Scousers during our stay, 2 guys from Eighton and a guy called Sid who was a bit of a face about town and took it upon himself to show us about. He reminded me a bit of Sam Kinison, and he always seemed to be wearing way too many clothes for the sunny climate. He'd take us to what would be my favourite place, Project Bar. It was kind of Moorish in the way it looked, and it had a basement with a small fountain and big cushions scattered all over the place. I liked it because you could skin up in there without any grief, and the music was a bit mellower than what was playing elsewhere. He'd also take us to Café Del Mar, which, like Project, was more chilled, and I guess in the early stages of what would become the Ibiza scene. The other 2 Scousers I think will have to be referred to as the Eighton baddies. From what we could make out, they were a little on the wrong side of the law, so I don't want to give their real names. We met them whilst we were on the beach somewhere on the island, and we heard the familiar, "You're alright, Frankie, la? Do you want any trips?" They'd been following Liverpool around Europe and headed to Ibiza rather than go home. I think they were also planting weed seeds up in the hills at the start of the season and then returning months later to farm the crop. Whether this was true or not, I don't know, but they always had plenty of grass and hash. They were scallies but top lads, and they spent time hanging around in the studio with us and going out drinking. The recording was usually done in 6-hour stints between midday and 6, and after that eyes were turned towards the bright lights of San Antonio. One of the hired motorbikes ended up being used on a track called Delirious, and our Silver Turns to Gold had a Balearic flavour in some of the guitar parts. The other tracks recorded were Watusi Love Juicy, Warriors of the Wasteland, Rage Hard, The Waves, All Climb Up to Heaven, which became Kill the Pain, and Maximum Joy. The latter was literally knocked out in a couple of hours. I recorded about 4 tracks of echoing guitars whilst Ped and Mark were still in bed, and they came down and added their parts, and Holly jammed a vocal over the top of it. The demo of it sounded great, and in the following sessions when we recorded the Liverpool album, I don't think any of the many versions recorded came close to the vibe of the demo. This is a classic case of chasing your tail, trying to recreate something that was thrown together without caution. When I started recording the guitars, it wasn't even a song and was nothing more than a guitar idea that I recorded while I was waiting for the others, so no real care went into the structure or the parts. I expected it to be logged and taken away to be worked on at a later date. Ped and Mark, and to a certain extent Holly, approached the track in the same way, and that thrown together vibe is why the demo has a certain charm to it. When the approach was more professional, the original vibe disappeared. We had a version of it during the Whistleord session that was rocking and a good representation, but I feel this was ruined back in London when Trevor started throwing the machinery at it, and I disliked the album version intensely. When we played the track live, it began like the album version but ended like the Whistleord version, and I think this would have been a happy marriage. I love Spain, and in fact I'm sitting in a villa in the mountains as I'm writing this chapter. My mate reckons my love affair with this wonderful country and its people started when Rafa Benitez turned up at Anfield with his Spanish imports, but I really think it dates back to this first visit in 1985. All in all, apart from damage to cars, bikes and livers, our Spanish adventure had been great fun and productive, but America was waiting, and beyond that, Japan. Let's get back on the road again.